We were a few minutes late. Thank you, Keith. Sorry, we were a few minutes late. My apologies, everybody. But we had a double technical hitch, and that caused us to be a little late. So apologies. We will give us as much time as we possibly can today. I'm Sharon Constanson. I'm chairman of the membership committee, and really pleased to spend some time with you here today, talking about the topic that is actually, it's almost too done. Yeah? Talk about when people in the street start buying shares and the taxi drivers start buying shares, that's the time you should start selling, because it's become overdone. So is ESG in that place where we've actually done too much of it? It's all we talk about. I remember back in the times when we got the Twin Peaks and the regulators went from the FSA to the FCA and the PRA, and everything that boardrooms did from then onwards was totally focused on one topic only, till eventually they were able to broaden out again into multiple topics. So where's ESG on a potential journey like that? And have we got to the stage where everyone's doing it because they have to, but they've no idea what they're doing or why they're doing it, which is even worse. So there's quite a few areas that we need to consider to make sure that this conversation is the right one, for the right reason, does deliver sustainability, and recognizes the stakeholders and the requirement for profitability at the same time as the whole journey, because otherwise we're not sustainable. So it's a big topic. We could talk about it literally for 6 months, but I don't think Roger would like to do that, and I don't think we want to listen to it for that long. So it's not practical in that respect. So apologies for the format of the slides and the way they're coming to you. Unfortunately, Roger's computer does not wish to send me the deck because it's too big, and doesn't wish to present the PowerPoint in a live view, but I'm sure you will manage with us as best as possible. So if you just enlarge your slides your screen as much as possible, you should be okay on it. We're going to do a presentation by Dr. Roger Barker first. We're then going to have an in-conversation session where I will be teasing out some of the points that he's brought up. And then after that, we will open it to the floor to ask questions. So please have some good, sensible, quality questions that a company secretary would be concerned about, so that we can use this as a learning experience for all COSECs, so that we are using this agenda to its maximum value for organizations for the right purpose. Dr. Roger Barker, I have known probably going on almost 20 years. I hate to admit that we've both probably grown older by 20 years during that same period of time. Roger's with the Institute of Directors, and he heads up their governance arena. That's where he was. He disappeared off to Europe for a little while. Now he's back at the IOD. He is eminently qualified to talk on governance matters, but very particularly on this area of ESG and where companies are on this journey. So Roger, if there's something in my introduction that you feel I've missed, because I think everyone has read up on you, that's why they're here, please add to what I have given everyone. And please share with us your slides, your discussion, your concerns, and equally importantly, the opportunities that are out there. And then we'll chat in about 15 or so minutes.
Well, thank you very much, Sharon, and hello to everyone. I'm really delighted to be with you today and to talk about what I think is a very topical, a very ubiquitous topic, which is ESG. And what I want to do today is perhaps just talk about a bit about the origins of ESG, where we've got to where we are, and then try and sort of assess where ESG goes from here. It's been incredibly successful. It's become so much part of our corporate furniture, but is it going to continue from here? There has been developing, especially in the United States, a bit of a backlash against ESG. So it'd be interesting to discuss how important and how much of a threat that is to ESG. But let me just start by right at the beginning by looking at what we actually mean by ESG, environmental, social and governance matters. Now, The first use of the term, of the notion of ESG, was actually a report published by the United Nations back in the early 2000s. And this put forward the idea that really investors in particular needed to go beyond the balance sheet, beyond looking at purely financial factors, and look at a broader range of issues which could affect the performance and the success of their investment portfolios. And the term ESG was born. Since then, it's had a sort of, initially, I suppose, in the first 10 years, it was competing with a number of other concepts like corporate social responsibility, triple bottom line investing, responsible business, and so on. But it didn't really, I think, take off until probably the last 5 or 6 years. And I think it's come to mean different things to different people. For some people, I suppose ESG represents a new way of doing business entirely, a kind of a revamping of capitalism, a capitalism which is not, just about profits, which is not about taking a very narrow shareholder-centric approach. It's about kind of adjusting capitalism so that it starts to take account of all those kind of externalities which affect business, which affects the environment, the planet, and so on, which perhaps conventional business hasn't fully taken account of. So it's a way, I suppose, of shifting the dial towards a more stakeholder-oriented capitalism rather than a shareholder capitalism. So I think, for some, it's a very ambitious project. I think for others, especially in the business world, it's really something much more pragmatic. It's more about extending risk management to look at a wider range of factors. So to look at really, I suppose, a wider range of non-financial, more intangible factors, which ultimately could pose risks and opportunities for organizations, especially in the longer term, and which therefore any sensible board of directors, any sensible company would really want to think carefully about, would want to take account of, in their risk registers, in their discussions around the boardroom table. So it's I suppose you can look at it in those two terms, either in a very kind of broad sense or a more narrow sense. What I would say though about ESG, and just I think that's reflected in this sort of list of factors which we've got here on the screen, it is a very broad and wide-ranging concept which is taking in a lot of different areas. I suppose a lot of people, when they're talking about ESG, are talking really about the E, the environment, the climate change aspect of ESG. And there are many different aspects to that. And then, of course, there's the whole kind of social dimension of ESG, covering issues which I've mentioned there, such as, ranging from the very pragmatic employee relationships to really the whole impact that an organization is having on the local community, and issues like human rights, modern slavery and child labor and so on. So very, very wide ranging there. And then governance, which is a topic, that we have been really considering for actually a very long time. And those of us who've been involved in the world of corporate governance, it's been a separate focus for a considerable period of time. Now, some people would argue that actually pulling together such a wide range of issues into kind of one concept is too much, and doesn't give us the sufficient level of focus. And some people also would argue, and I have some sympathy with this, that in some respects governance is a rather different topic to that of environment and social, and that perhaps pulling them together into the same concept is not entirely appropriate. I mean, after all, the issues relating to environmental impact and social impact of business, they're they all relate to decisions which a company takes. They relate to its strategy, to its operations and its activities. Governance, on the other hand, is all about the processes through which decision making takes place within an organization. It's, as it were, sitting at a higher level than the other two factors, which isn't to say that any one of those three is more important than the other, but governance is, I think, qualitatively different in nature to environment and social. So I think that that's one of the concerns which about lumping all of these three areas together. And as I mentioned right at the start, this was originally a concept derived for investors to guide their activities. So a question, I think, for companies, for boards and corporates is, to what extent is ESG as a concept? Does that fit into what a board and a company is doing? Or perhaps isn't it more sensible to break down these areas into more individual topics which can be assessed by boards and by companies? So, to look at sustainability as a separate topic, and to look at governance as a separate issue, and so on. So, does ESG lead to better performance? I think from the investor perspective, there's mixed evidence here. Certainly, based on these metrics from MSCI, between the kind of early 2010s and up right up until the pandemic, there was good empirical evidence that ESG oriented stocks were outperforming those that were less ESG oriented. But of course, there's no guarantee of that, and I suppose we really shouldn't expect there to be. In the periods since the energy crisis, we've had a situation where non-ESG type stocks have outperformed. Stocks which have been based on all the sort of bad old-fashioned industries like fossil fuels, for example. They have benefited from high energy prices and have outperformed. And anyway, stock market performance depends on the degree to which certain factors are discounted in existing share prices. So there's no guarantee necessarily that an ESG oriented stock will outperform, but it certainly has during certain periods. I think when you look at regulation and the regulatory environment, the ecosystem which is developing around ESG, it is very complicated for companies. I mean, as you can see in the slide, there's a whole morass of different disclosure and sustainability frameworks, ESG factors being taken account of by credit agencies, by different benchmarks. It does create a confusing picture, I think, for any board director. At the moment, I think the focus is pretty much on disclosure, and the range of initiatives out there which are seeking to develop ESG frameworks of disclosure, particularly with regard to climate change, but also in other areas as well. And at the moment, we're very much waiting for three bodies to publish final rules relating to how they will see ESG disclosure happening. In the United States, the Securities and Exchange Commission is due to finalize its rules on climate disclosure this year. That American companies are waiting for that with great expectation to see how far that will go. We have the IFRS Sustainability Standards Board, which is due to publish climate accounting standards later this year. And also within Europe, within the framework of the European reporting framework, we are going to see EFRAG, which is a body within the European Union, produce its own accounting standards relating to ESG factors, going actually beyond just sustainability reporting, but and covering a much wider range of ESG type reporting, and will be expanding the existing non-financial reporting requirements which have existed in the EU for some time. So these are all bodies where we're very much awaiting some kind of decisions in the near future. But there are quite a few controversies relating to all of this. I think one of the big ones will be the extent to which these new disclosure standards can encapsulate so-called scope 3 emission reporting. As I'm sure you know, the way in which greenhouse gas emissions are reported on or categorized is in terms of so-called scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3 emissions. Scope 1 Scope 1 emissions being, of course, being the direct emissions of a company, scope 2 being those that arise from its energy sources, and scope 3 being the emissions which arise from its supply chain and in fact its value chain, which many argue represents the most important, the most substantial aspect of emissions of any organization. So the question is, will these new disclosure standards, which we're waiting for, will they include a requirement to report on scope 3 emissions? On the one hand, I suppose the climate activists are saying you've got to report on scope 3 emissions, otherwise what's the point? But companies are saying, well, look, it's incredibly complicated to go down multiple layers of the supply chain and to work out what different suppliers, different contractors are actually emitting. And it will be a huge exercise of data collection. Some, of course, multinational organizations having several thousand different suppliers, 30, 40 layers of the supply chain, 30, 40 different tiers. So that it's going to be interesting to see where the likes of the SEC, for example, in the US come out. Will they require scope 3 emissions to be reported on? Another big issue, I think, that we should mention in this whole debate around reporting is the notion of double materiality. Now, double materiality refers to the idea that when you are reporting stuff about ESG or climate or sustainability, that you don't only disclose information that is relevant to the future of the company itself, you also report on the impact that the company is having on the wider environment, so on society, on the planet, the wider planet. And they are, I think, are two different ways of approaching corporate disclosure. Should corporate disclosure be about helping you, say, as a shareholder or an investor, to decide what I need to know if I'm going to invest in this company? What are the risks potentially that I'm facing as a stakeholder or an investor in this company? And so it's really about, it's an aspect of risk assessment, that kind of disclosure. Or does actually wider society needs to understand the broader impact of the company on the planet and society? And those two different philosophies around corporate disclosure, I don't think that we have yet come to a consensus on how the companies should report. In the EU, they're very much talking about disclosure based on double materiality, and that within the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, which is a big piece of legislation that they have there, that is the basis on which ESG factors will be disclosed. But will the SEC take a similar point of view? Will the International Sustainability Standards Board take a similar point of view? We will have to see, because of course it does massively increase the volume of reporting and the complexity of reporting that will be required. So of course, something else I just mentioned there is how ESG ratings have become important, rather like credit ratings, but they're much more problematical, I think. There's very little correlation between what one ESG rating is saying is a good ESG company and what another is saying. And so, that lack of consistency, that lack of consensus about what is good ESG is an issue. But of course, when we don't get these issues of disclosure and reporting right, then we have accusations of greenwashing, that companies are getting on the bandwagon of the whole ESG debate and using that to just make themselves look good or to market their products and services. And so there's a huge amount, I think, of regulatory effort going in to try to combat that, both in the investment industry and also we're seeing it in the courts. A lot of companies are being sued. They're having lawsuits brought against them in respect of greenwashing claims. But amidst all of this rise in ESG, and I think the ESG is also, of course, being driven by a huge amount of money, which is flowing into ESG investment funds, which are seeking a home, an investment home. That's providing a huge impetus for ESG. But in the midst of that, there is also a backlash. And we're really seeing this in the US at the moment, particularly at the state level, actually. And just last week, the Republican-controlled administration in Florida, where Ron DeSantis is the governor, a potential presidential candidate, they just passed legislation which would actually ban the state of Florida from issuing green bonds, and also banning and preventing pension funds investing state assets from using ESG criteria in their investment decisions. And a number of other Republican states have been following that type of approach. And I think also that's why I think there's a lot of political pressure being placed on the SEC in terms of the type of decisions they're going to take in terms of their new disclosure rules, coming from this new anti ESG wing of politics within the US. And I have to say, it has, unfortunately, because of this, ESG is increasingly becoming politicized. ESG is being seen as a kind of, the phrase often being used is as the manifestation of woke capitalism. So it's, which is a shame, because those of us who wish to use ESG factors as an aspect of good risk management don't want to see it politicized in this way and see that as being unhelpful. But that is nonetheless what is happening. Now, what we may see going forward is that ESG will move from a focus on disclosure to increasingly a focus on the fiduciary duties of directors and incorporating an ESG perspective into directors' legal duties as specified in the Companies Act. That there is a movement in the UK called the Better Business Act, which is all about reforming Section 172 of the Companies Act so that it has more of a stakeholder orientation rather than, should we say, a shareholder primacy orientation. And that's something which is being campaigned for. I don't think that will has much traction with the current government, but perhaps with the future government, it could become more important. And of course, even the existing fiduciary framework for directors is being tested by ESG campaigners. And one high-profile case I'll draw your attention to is that the current directors of Shell are currently being taken to court by Client Earth, which is an NGO, a climate activist NGO, and a number of other institutional investors. And they are arguing that the directors of Shell are actually in breach of their duties under the Companies Act in terms of how they are managing climate risk. And it's going to be interesting to see whether this legal action succeeds or not. I suspect that it won't succeed, but on the basis of the law as it is. But nonetheless, their ESG and climate activists are using, I think, every avenue to try and raise awareness of their cause. So, to summarize, where do we stand in terms of ESG? I think we've gone from a situation in which ESG was becoming incredibly dominant, really promoted and pushed forward by investors and by many other stakeholder groups within business, and was seen as really the new way of doing business. But now we're experiencing a bit of a pushback. Maybe we are past peak ESG, in the sense that, not in the sense that the issues which ESG refers to will become any less important in the future. I don't think that will be the case. But maybe the ESG concept, the specific way of packaging together these ideas, may not necessarily be the way that we think about it going forward in the indefinite future. But with that sort of caveat in mind, Sharon, I think I'll pull down my slides and we'll open to discussion.
Thanks very much, Roger. Greatly appreciated. And I did find highly, highly fascinating how we go through themes and fashions and trends and noise and what's popular and how that impacts business. But if we think back to the time during the election campaign, Cameron was seen going and doing something to do with planet Earth. And logos were in blue and not in green and things like that, and the criticisms that were happening around using that to influence people's voting. So politicized, I get. Using it to influence for the better of intentionally, yes. And what we really need to do is find a moment for companies to actually be a lot more practical about things. Keith, if I could just ask you if I could have a moment to share my screen. There's just something I want to share with you that comes out of a comment you made, Roger, which I think just confirms some of the thinking around these words that we use and whether they are appropriate or not. Thank you, Keith. Appreciate it. And guys, I'm not going to try and put this onto a full screen view because it's only 2 slides I want to share. If we look at the modern agenda, GE and E, S, and G going clockwise around there, and within society, as you said, diversity, equity, and inclusion. My philosophy is we've got them both the wrong way around. So if we say the governance is the foundation, so alludes to your point exactly, and interesting, Roger, you're the first person, other than myself, that I've heard talk about this topic in this logical way. And my view is if we get the governance right of our organizations and our organizations are efficient and they are operating effectively, we have the right culture, we have the right leadership, we have the right structure in our boardroom, we have the right directors in our boardroom, we have the right executives, we know what is important, we've defined our strategy, all the governance stuff is in place. Huge assumption, but let's go from there. We then look at our stakeholders. Another way of describing S, it can be social, it can be society, it can be stakeholders, it can be supply chain. All of them you covered. So those are the various aspects, including the staff, which is one of our key stakeholders, is our people. So we then have to bring the people into this journey, bring them into the culture of the organization, the vision and mission and purpose of our organization. So we get corporate buy-in and we get their engagement and that they walk the talk as equally as, let's assume, executive and the board are doing. We get that right. Sorry, can whoever's off mute, can you just turn your, thank you very much. Somebody keeps coming off mute. Thanks a lot. And then now that we are running the organization well, our board is doing the right thing, we're thinking in the correct place, we now have headspace to look at the environment, which in itself is a monster topic. And one of the things you covered a little while ago in your speech is about, what do we focus on, where do we focus? And the immediate thought that came to me as you were speaking is this is almost too big to grasp. So I see the first 2 as being our foundations. Foundation are building blocks, and now we put the roof on, we've now got space in which to think. So I think that is my view of how ESG should be GSE. And then I get really, hold on, where's that gone? There. sorry, my apologies. The next aspect that I like to look at is I think DE and I are also the wrong way around. Whoever learned to spell these things and put the cart before the horse, I have no idea, but that's again a personal opinion. If we have an inclusive mindset in our business, it's set in our culture, it's set in our governance, it's set in our leadership, and we are performing an inclusive way of being in our business, our HR policies, our remuneration committees, our appointment processes, everything is inclusive in the way we behave. Our governance and our policies have ensured that we have an equity approach towards the relative groups of people. Once again, it comes from our governance side that gives us the equity. The outcome is what we're all looking for. It's diversity. And we will get aligned diversity. We will not get chaos. What always worries me, I often talk about a menagerie of animals, ranging from snakes to whales and everything in between. And you call that diversity. Well, I feel very sorry for the organization and the chair of that organization and the CEO of that organization, because it's going to be total chaos forever. But if we have a pack of dogs ranging from Chihuahuas to Great Danes, or hopefully a little bit more aligned, a whole different breed of terriers, we are now going to have an aligned, useful diversity that's not going to sidetrack the organization and bring quality conversation. And we can then work with that to then build on what is the modern agenda that we should be talking about in our business. So sorry, guys, I hadn't planned to do that, but you led me to one of my passions and moments of why these things are so important, that we do look at these things the right way around. We don't just do it for the sake of the word ESG. Well, what does it really mean? So that's my point. I don't know if you want any feedback on that before I ask you any further questions.
Yes, well,
I got a little carried away there.
I know. Well, Sharon, I completely agree with you. I mean, I do feel that governance comes first, and I know that I'm talking amongst a group of friends here on this call that we all are the governance believers, and but I really believe it's true. I think the governance comes first, and then through the governance framework, one addresses a whole range of important topics for the organization, of which environmental issues are very important issues, as indeed are sort of social impact issues, but as are other issues, yes. So the strategy of the organization, risk management, and many other things which the board needs to look at. But there is something, and I suppose I have mixed feelings about ESG. I mean, there's no doubt that it seems to have grabbed people's imagination and got them thinking about certain issues which they should be thinking about. So that is good, and it seems to have captured the imagination of the marketeers who are selling investment funds and raising money on the basis that put your money in an ESG fund and it will be invested in responsible business. So that has been good, but I think conceptually I do have a problem with it. And so sometimes people come to me and say, well, should we set up an ESG committee within our company, or an ESG subcommittee of the board, for example, or should we have someone responsible for ESG? And questions like that. And I struggle with that, because to me, the concept of ESG is too inaccurate and unfocused a concept to try and implement it in that way. It's not really corporate. We must always remember it's an investor oriented term that's been used for them to sort of organize their activities from an investor perspective. I feel it's not necessarily as that applicable in a literal sense to the corporate scenario.
I think that's probably why it has this mismatch that we are talking about from slightly different lenses, but for exactly the right reasons and the right outcome. But I think what has happened is the market for so long has ignored these issues and has pushed back on them at board level, saying, not on my watch, I'm retiring in 3 years' time. I don't need to take on something so big and complex. I don't know where to start. To others who have a passion for it, who are pushing for these issues because they are critically important. And as we know, if we don't measure something, nothing changes. So if we don't talk about something, we don't make people accountable for something, nothing is going to change. So I think what, in my personal opinion, I think the journey has gone in the right direction, that people are taking notice of it. What we need to do now in corporates, in my view, is we should be refining our agenda. We should be refining how we look at what that is relevant to our business, and not just rush around in the big speak that everyone is talking about and think that we are now doing it right. And we've got two aspects there. We've got the one aspect where we've got this greenwashing because we say we're doing everything we're not, or puffering up things we're doing a little bit of. And the other one is companies are saying, we're doing all this stuff. You then accuse me of greenwashing. You then take me to court, being the worst case scenario, to green hushing,
Yes.
being everybody's now playing down what they're doing because of the litigation risk, and
Yes.
that they get taken to court. So you get this now, the green hushing that's coming up the other way, because it actually hurts when we talk about how good we're doing and you don't like what we're doing. Or we are genuinely puffing it up, so we better hush up. So,
well, yes. I mean, to me, the classic example recently is BP. So a year or so ago, BP was, staking its claim to being the most progressive of the fossil fuel companies. With quite an ambitious agenda for cutting its emissions. And even it had a shareholder vote at the AGM on that, which was supported. Now, of course, has decided to change its strategy somewhat and less aggressively, reduce its fossil fuel production, while still being ahead of most other fossil fuel companies, very much still being ahead of the pack. But because it had raised its head above the parapet previously, it's now, the target for those who feel that oil companies are not doing enough. And so, even though it's still best in class, it's really coming in for a lot of flack, and we saw that at its AGM the other day. So, yeah, green hushing is increasingly. I think boards are thinking green hushing perhaps is a slightly wiser, smarter strategy.
And I think it's also, I would advise boards, make sure you understand what you're talking about, rather than rushing on a path of, that's what everyone else is doing, so I suppose I'd better do it too, and not actually thinking about the relevance to the company. I mean, talking at a very, very immature end of the scale, SMEs go and do this sort of 3-5 question assessment online to say that they've taken a light bulb out and put another kind of light bulb in, and they've put timing meters onto lights that come on, or onto whatever else. And now all of a sudden they get this massive kite mark to say that they are ESG compliant and look how good they are. We've done nothing. So that other end is actually undermining the value of it. So people go and do that little questionnaire so that they can get accepted in tenders because they can tick a box. And I look at that and I think that for me is genuine greenwashing. And I'm using an SME as an example who would readily do that because they can't really make a difference. Yes, there's certain things they could do. Of course, there's waste management and air conditioning management and things they can do. But again, it's not a big picture stuff.
Yep, I think we are, I think, going to see that. Now you touch on SMEs, I think we are going to see this kind of next phase of this whole debate starting to affect SMEs more, because relating, I think, to larger companies needing to actually disclose and analyze what's going on in their supply chain, and that's then
That's when
affecting
they're going to get caught.
SMEs. And you see with the IOD, I've seen some interesting emails. For example, the likes of Tesco have sent out to its suppliers saying, we need to know, you need to tell us, what is your carbon footprint? When is the date you're going to be hitting net zero? What's your planned target date? And what are the various steps in the journey, the transition steps? And so I can imagine, an SME receiving that is probably thinking, "Oh, my good
I'll
grief,
go
what
supply
do I
somebody
do?"
else.
Hands in the air. And of course, then that's great business opportunity for the kind of, as you say, the consultants who provide you with a nice kite mark to say that you are, ESG compliant, or you're moving in the right direction as far as net zero is concerned. But it's yes, but the lack of standardization around that, I think, is a concern. Because I'm sure that not everyone who's doing that is necessarily doing the ideal job. But I think SMEs will. Perhaps this is a topic which has been very much focused on listed companies thus far, but will increasingly start to ripple out towards SMEs.
We're going to see with the new iteration of the code, when it does eventually hit our desks at some point in time, as to whether it follows the likes of the South African Corporate Governance Code, where it applies to all listed companies, not just 350, all listed companies and their supply chain, which you might as well say, well, that includes everybody, because the listed companies will be supported by such a broad section of the economy that you're effectively now moving it out. So it'll be interesting to see how our code evolves in that space. The area that you brought up as well, which I find a very fascinating area, and an area typically in the FTSE 250 and lower, is not handled well outside of financial services particularly, is organizations actually owning risk management at a board level. They don't want to put in a committee because it's the board responsibility, but the board hasn't a clue how to start or where to start, doesn't have any expertise, and is therefore fumbling around in the risk management space. If we were to be consulting to an organization now, it's not the top end of the market, it's next tier down, still covered by the code though, and we say to them, risk management now is a critical aspect of what the board needs to take ownership of. How would you guide them to own this modern agenda within their risk management area that they have to work in? Because the two go hand in hand, in my view, and they need to walk the talk from the board level.
They do, and I think this is, in a way, the pragmatic way of looking at ESG is that it is a development towards a more comprehensive risk management process, which is considering the risk to the organization, particularly in the longer term. And so I do think that it does involve looking at risk registers and risk processes, and no longer seeing them as being a kind of purely financial type of exercise. And I think that means you're going to need to widen the sort of people who are involved in assessing the risks in the organization and what the mitigating factors should be. And really that I think is a big change that ESG demands. So so effectively risk management evolves from being, should we say, a branch of the finance function to something which is, much broader, much more encompassing of, a lot of more intangible and soft aspects of a company's functioning. And you would include within that category things like corporate culture and behaviors and conduct, and just looking at what's going on at the CBI at the moment, it's providing lessons for all of us. I'm especially, I'm sitting here at the IOD, and we're very much wanting to learn the lessons of that. But equally in any organization, there have to be people on the board who are thinking about, well, the board needs to have a mechanism to think about these things.
I think the key word that goes with that is reputational risk.
Yeah.
So many organizations think their reputation is perfect because they think it's perfect. What they don't realize is the stakeholder of today thinks differently to you because of invariably age difference. And they've had different experiences in technology and in the modern agenda of how they expect companies to behave. And if we're not understanding the things that are going to impact our reputation, we're not going to get the risks right either.
No.
And we're not going to talk about them correctly either.
And it's just reflecting on the CBI situation. It was interesting how flabbergasted the board members were, that this had happened, that they thought everything was great. They had no idea and so that, as you say, Sharon, it leads to the question, were they monitoring and thinking about the right things?
Yeah. And so often there's, and because of the way our governance is structured, the way board meetings work and the way they have to have that divide from executives, which I all agree with, companies, board directors invariably don't know the business. They're not there. They don't ever go there to feel the business in many ways. But there was a question that mentioned here is that ESG and DEI are really a journey, as in going for net zero, doing all the things we're doing. You can only start from where you are as an organization. You can only evolve further from that perspective. So not starting is not an excuse. We need to start. And if we all do one thing, our planet will be better off if we do make one effort, every single one of us. So it's actually quite interesting from that perspective. There's talking about one of the delegates is talking about some responsibilities and experience they've had with some of the reporting requirements and how onerous those can be, to the point you actually think, who's benefiting from that cost of production to satisfy a tick box that an investor, in theory, knows a bit more about my business than they might have otherwise known? And I remember reading a report in a FTSE 250 company, and I was reading through their risk report. And I expected to go in there to do the evaluation, expecting their risk management function to be on steroids, because this report was amazing. It was one of the best reports I've ever seen on risk management. And I got there, they didn't have a risk committee, they didn't have a risk head, they didn't focus on risk. They were in an area that was highly risky. They didn't recognize that at all. So in discussion with the company secretary, I said, how come we've got such a good report and yet I don't see any correlation? He says, I suppose I have to admit it's the report I'd like to be able to have written. I'd like it to have been what it is. I wrote the report I want things to be. So I said, this is long before the words of greenwashing and things like this. So we could have called that risk washing. Definitely a very different place to where people are at the moment. One of the things that I see quite often when I'm working with boards is the older, and I am generalizing now, so please, no offense to anybody in any way. Typically your board is older, particularly the chair, who is invariably older than the CEO, may or may not have industry knowledge of that business. But the barrier to having an open debate, risk dialogue with ESG and whatever elements of it that we want to cover is almost, I'm too scared of it. I don't understand it. I've never had to deal with it before. So why must I do this in my last 5 years of my corporate career? Why do I want to take on something that is this complex and this difficult and I don't really know what to do? I see it quite often. How would you advise that board and that chairman to take at least a baby step or something? How would you work with such a board? You're on mute.
Yeah, I think I would perhaps, just break it down. Rather than saying we're going to just adopt an ESG approach. I think that's just a label. You can start to address specific issues, and you, I think it's much easier to connect specific issues to the business risks and to the business prospects. So I think that's the way I would do it.
I
I
agree
think
with you.
ultimately, of course, what we want to do is integrate ESG factors in a seamless way with everything, the whole decision-making process that's going on at a board. Having separate committees or separate individuals with specific responsibilities is not really the ideal way forward. We want it to
Might be to get
be
it going.
integrated. Yeah,
It
it
might
might be
be
to get it going, and
going.
of course, this is where I think it's very useful in boards, I think, to bring in external perspectives, and to build those into board meetings. I'm sure many people do that here. That it's not just about talking about the specific issues which need immediate decisions, the here and now. It's also about using board meetings to broaden the perspective of board members around longer term risks and opportunities, and that's, I think, something that a good board will want to have a balance between, I suppose, those two types of activities.
Something I
yeah,
would add to what you've suggested, and I wouldn't, I mean, what you suggest is absolutely, I agree 100%. But maybe what they could also do is actually, with the help of the company secretary, you say, look how much of ESG we've already done, because we have addressed our policies, our procedures. We've modernized a whole bunch of things we're doing in the business. We are thinking forward. Look what we've done with our culture. Look how we've done with our board meeting governance and all the things that comes out of the G part of it. Look how much we have done. Look at the steps we've taken in the greater diversity picture, and actually go and say, actually, it's not all of the stuff, because how much of this have we actually already done?
yes.
We're looking at our carbon footprint. We've changed the way our offices work due to hybrid working. That is something that will have had an impact. So I would just add to breaking it down is actually showing what the wins have already been.
Yes, and of course, that the company secretary will be a key influencer here, in terms of taking this agenda forward, and will probably be instrumental, in how the chairman or chair decides to address this. So,
and good support from a company secretary will get the chair through that feeling of fear, of the unknown, or something that actually in most cases never been their day job, and therefore it's fine that they're in a fearful place. I don't think it's the end of the world at all. What they do need is support to realize that actually they do know most of the stuff already.
yes.
And it's not all about the polar ice cap melting. It's about the greater ambit of what we're talking about.
Yes.
One of the delegates made reference to the complexity of some of the regulations, and you were talking about when we are going cross-border between what the US is doing, as a simple example, what the UK is doing and what Europe is doing. And when you've got your global concerns with the foot in each one of those continents, least of all the rest of them, how that makes that reporting almost at risk of being gold-plated to match the requirements of the different regions.
I think that's right. I think it's going to become quite complicated. So I mean, I would expect that the UK will, adopt the new rules of the International Sustainability Standards Board, which is the IFRS body, which is working out climate accounting standards. But then there's no guarantee that they're necessarily going to be perfectly aligned with what the EU is doing through its own approach, through EFRAG, and what the approach that the SEC is going to take. So that's going to, yeah, there may well be different approaches, some may be more comprehensive, some may adopt, as I was saying before, more a double materiality approach as opposed to you know, a more company specific approach. So it is going to get pretty complicated. It would be so much better if we could all unite around, you know, a common standard. But you know, that's obviously easier said than done.
I can see our company secretaries. Okay, today I've got my Europe head on.
Yeah.
Today I've got my UK head on. Tomorrow I've actually got my US head on. And you can almost see them being sort of a bit confused as to who they might be from time to time. So once again, in these kind of environments, we need to provide some support and guidance to company secretaries and to places where they have a much wider regional impact upon some of the work that they are doing. And we can never underestimate the complexity of matching your reporting with authenticity of content and saying the right things at the same time so that you don't kill your reputation. Do you want to give us a last comment, Roger? Anything you'd like to leave us with? I've covered most of the questions that have come up in the chat in the conversations we have had.
Yes, I think ESG, despite the backlash that's occurring, the kind of the issues which currently are considered under ESG are absolutely here to stay. You know, business has fundamentally changed, I think, compared to say 20 years ago, when, you know, it was all about shareholder value. Jack Welch, you know, that type of it's all about the shareholder. Milton Friedman encompassed that, you know, in the things that he wrote. We've moved away from that, but whether ESG is the right banner, the right organizing concept, as it were, with which to take this forward, there I have more doubts. I'm not sure about that. But the underlying issues are things we're going to have to engage with, and we're going to have to really become expert on. As directors, as company secretaries, as anyone within in any position of responsibility within an organization.
And we can't turn our back on it anymore. These things are here with us and will be influencing us. I'd like to thank everyone for joining us today. Let your colleagues and friends know about this session, because there will be a recording, and we'll be able to share these discussions further and wider. So thanks very much for the comments, the positive comments. And you were talking about scope 1, 2, and 3, and there's some comments on that one as well. And you referred to the consulting world as making a killing. It's haymaking time. But in respect to everybody's 1 hour, thank you very much, Roger. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
It was really, really insightful and engaging. We could have been, as we know, we could always been here a lot longer. But we leave on a hiatus, we'll be remembered, and people will come back for more. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Sharon, and thanks everyone.
All the best.
All the best.
Cheers. Bye.
Bye-bye.